Welcome back to BetterHelp's In-Session series. My name is Hesu Jo, and I'm a licensed therapist here on the clinical operations team at BetterHelp. Today, I'm super excited to be joined by Nicholas Flickinger, a licensed clinical social worker based out of West Hollywood in California, like me. And Nicholas received his undergraduate and graduate degrees at North Carolina State University and now works with individuals and couples, specializing in the LGBTQ community in areas of anxiety, depression, relationships, low self-worth, body image, gender and sexuality, grief, and addiction. He has worked in collegiate mental health, community mental health, the Los Angeles LGBT Center, and now in private practice in West Hollywood. Nicholas is also a fellow BetterHelp therapist. So thank you so much, Nicholas, for being with us on our In-Session series today. To start us off, I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about your journey to becoming a therapist and why you chose this career path.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me. Glad to be here. So yeah, just a little bit about, what led me to become a therapist was, kind of a common story among therapists, I think, is that my own journey, my own experiences with therapists in the past really inspired me to do what I do today. I know what it's like to be on the other side of the table. I know what it's like to be on the client side. And for me, my relationship with one of my therapists, Nikki, was pretty transformative in my own life, with my own identity, with me finding coping skills when I was young to be able to deal with and manage with the things that I was going through in my life. And that really inspired me to, ask her what led her on the path that she went on. And I pretty much followed in her footsteps. And, trying to figure out a little bit of what I wanted to do with my life, my career, it became clear to me that, there's not anything else that I would rather do or more meaningful than being able to work with people and kind of be a little bit of what she was to me and help people on that same kind of journey. And I love what I do. So.
Thank you for sharing that. And I got chills because this thing that you're talking about, it's a common thing that you probably hear from therapists, and that is correct. So many of us have also had this transformative experience, and to see folks turn that positive thing into our livelihood, into our career, I think that is efficacy in itself. It shows how effective this work is. And I'm very thankful for Nikki, now for you, Nicholas, because you're bringing yourself, you're really bringing pieces of who you are as a person into this work, and that makes it so much more meaningful, impactful. And so we're here today to talk about LGBTQ specific concerns in therapy. So it sounds like you kind of dove into some of these things yourself. So I know this is a broad topic. For some folks, it's the main topic they bring to therapy. For many others, it's not the main thing. So I'm wondering if we can and kind of explore these things with you. So high level, to start us off, like what are some of the things you see as being presenting concerns or primary issues that folks in the community bring to therapy?
There's, of course, as broad of a range of issues that people bring in as there are folks in the queer community. And I'll use, queer community as the general, mouthful of LGBTQ and the whole rainbow. So, a lot of the things that we see with folks, are obviously trying to work through their own sexuality and gender identity issues, right? And the things that come along with that, right? From that come issues with family, complex relationships, and also, with those things, we see substance abuse being one unhealthy coping skill that we see come out of that is really common and rampant in the community.
Mhm.
And with issues of self-identity, we see anxiety and depression, negative core beliefs about ourselves, low self-esteem, and it can kind of spin out and spiral into every area of someone's life, right? So we might be looking at an issue or something happening in the workplace, but really the roots of that might be in someone's childhood and their relationship with a parent, and the lack of self-worth that might have come from, say, being rejected by a family
Mhm.
member due to your sexuality or gender identity, being rejected by a faith community, being rejected by a school community, right, which are really common things.
Mhm.
And if it's okay, I just want to throw out a few statistics that I feel like are really, kind of show at a high level a little bit of why focusing on LGBT specific issues and having that access is so important. So my statistics come from NAMI, so the National Alliance on Mental Illness. So LGBTQ adults being more than twice as likely as heterosexual counterparts to experience mental health conditions. Transgender individuals are nearly 4 times as likely. Then when we look at LGBTQ youth, 40% of school-aged children have said that they reported harassment or assault at school as a result of their identity, significantly impacting their mental health. The Trevor Project also says that 37% of LGBTQ youth said that they have homes that are safe and affirming spaces. So that is only 37%. And that's,
Mhm.
even with the change that we've seen in society, still a pretty sad statistic to see that
Yeah.
such low levels.
Yeah. I mean, these stats, I think for many of us in the field are not surprising, but it's still alarming and it's still discouraging to hear that every time it comes up. Um, can you share some of your thoughts of why these stats are the way they are? Like, why is it that we see prevalence rates of, not just disorders, but even suicide rate? Why do you think it might be higher for folks in the queer community?
Yeah, I think a lot of it stems from, let's say, a foundational place of family environments. There's still so much stigma, outside of big cities. We can kind of be in a little bit of a bubble, say in Los Angeles, the Bay, New York, and not recognize that there's still broad swaths of this country and communities all over the place that aren't accepting of
Mhm.
LGBTQ people. And when folks are rejected from their families, people get kicked out of their families. I've heard horror stories of folks 15, 16 years old having to take care of themselves. We have the Los Angeles LGBT Center here, which has a massive program for youth that are unhoused as a result of being kicked out of their family and rejected based on their gender identity or sexual identity. So when we lose all of those supports, right, when we lose those supports that are supposed to be there for emotional support, financial and basic needs support, right, and that level of insecurity makes folks question themselves. That not being able to have those types of supports makes folks lean on potentially unhealthy supports, right? A coping mechanism can be substance abuse, right? If we have internalized homophobia, let's say from family members, we have to find some way to cope with those thoughts, right? Negative thinking leads to negative behaviors, can lead to negative thoughts about self, and it can create a big feedback loop. And so if we're rejected by our families, that foundation of our self-worth is already in question, right? That foundation of who we are. If we have a mother and a father, the folks who are supposed to be taking care of us, parenting us, teaching us how to think about ourselves, how to love ourselves, how to care for ourselves, are rejecting who we are inherently, that can lead to really, really disastrous outcomes. Like you said, higher suicide rates, all of those things. In the trans community, 40% of trans folks have attempted suicide compared to less than 5% of the general population. Um, and to add on to that, also religious trauma and being rejected from faith communities. If you are brought up in a community where you are a part of a faith community, whatever that might look like, there's a lot of stigma within, say, the Judeo-Christian traditions here in this country, which can be, prevalent in certain areas. We end up being really integrated in these communities and then being rejected from these communities, right, based on who we are. And those sorts of things, right, can lead folks to kind of lose a coping skill, say spirituality and connection to something outside of themselves, right? And if we feel rejected by family, feel rejected by a faith community, be feeling rejected by a spiritual path, right, then that self-esteem, that self-worth is going to carry over at everything, right? If we don't think that we are worthy or worth enough, we're going to choose unhealthy relationships, right? I'm not good enough, so I'm going to accept this behavior that might be unacceptable. I might accept physical abuse. I might accept emotional abuse, right? And so these things that are seemingly, just events that happen in childhood or in adolescence really carry over into folks' adult lives, whether it's not feeling good enough or worthy enough at work or in romantic relationships or friendships, right? We can keep that cycle going by accepting things that might be unacceptable, and then that causes us to believe that that's what we deserve and that's what we accept, right? And so that's kind of a big, broad overview of what that flow of events can look like over time for queer folks.
so many different pieces of what you said. I could see myself turning that into a full conversation of its own. And there's only so much we can talk about in this limited amount of time. But I really appreciated that synopsis. And, while you were speaking, I was thinking of like anxiety, depression, relationship issues, family drama. These are universal. Everybody has these problems or challenges at some point in their life. But
Mm.
what I'm hearing also is like it might be exacerbated for folks in this community because for many of the people, unfortunately, they lose out on something that leads to a better prognosis for all of us, which is having a solid support system, which is
Mm.
having a family system that accepts us, that encourages us, that empowers us to continue this journey of loving ourselves, finding how we fit into this world.
Mm.
And what I'm hearing you describe is that a lot of folks in this community, a lot of folks that are in really young ages in this community are facing rejection from family, and I can imagine that feeling like this world that I'm learning to be a part of, it's not safe. The people in this world that are supposed to love me unconditionally are the ones that have shown me that maybe that's not true, which if you start believing in that, I can see, like you said, turning to certain reckless behaviors or other things to try to feel something different or not feel anything at all. Do you find that like folks in the community, are they more likely to seek out mental health services then if they have so many more issues that we're able to see through this reporting, or what does that look like in reality?
Yeah, I think, and I'm glad we're getting over to that, sorry, because we covered like kind of a big part of like what the problem is. And I think this kind of shifts us over into like the solution, right? And I think in the queer community is pretty generally encouraged, right? There's a lot of positive image around seeking mental health as a resource, as something that's positive, right? We can so often hear, so many negative stigmas around what it means to seek help, to seek therapy, right? And the things that can come along with that. But I think in the queer community, it's really encouraged, because so many folks have had wonderful journeys. And unfortunately, there can be folks that have really negative experiences if it's like sometimes religious counseling and trauma, right? Or conversion therapy, things like that, right? There can be a lot of stigma against it. But I think as a whole, the queer community is really encouraging of seeking therapy, right? We don't need to be in the most extreme case, the most severe place to
Mhm.
seek therapy, right? We can sometimes just want to work on, how we view ourselves, figuring out our own identity, being curious with our identity. It's not always these dire consequences. Sometimes, we can have a sense of, having fluidity in our sexuality, trying to find where in the rainbow we meet, right? Whether that is, somewhere in the fluid or the pansexual community, there's a big, broad place that we can all fall, right? And with the family piece, right? One thing that if we look over and kind of how sometimes queer therapy can be a little different, right? Is with the general population, it can be encouraged, right, with anxiety and depression to seek family support and all of these things that might not be available to everyone, right? So
Mhm.
in queer therapy, a lot of times we can certainly have that. Many folks do, and that is wonderful. But one concept that is really, really helpful in the queer community is this concept of made family, right? Which is it's almost like this fictive kin that we can create our own community if we have been rejected or pushed out of the places that we used to call home, right?
Mhm.
We form everything from communities like West Hollywood making, its own little bubble, its own little area that folks can know are safe and accepting and lean on one another, right? With those things, the solutions can be similar. They just can look a little different on the outside, which is why sometimes having that queer perspective can be really helpful, whether it's from a queer therapist or a queer allied therapist. That can be really powerful as far as being able to approach those things, right?
Mhm.
A
Mhm.
lot of the same tools work with folks in the LGBT community as work in others, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Challenging our cognitions, our thoughts about ourselves, our core beliefs, and also challenging and changing our behaviors, some behaviors that might be unhealthy and might be keeping that cycle of internalized homophobia or self-abuse alive over time, right?
Mhm.
So CBT, we look at core beliefs, right? If we have a core belief that our identity is wrong or broken, or there's something wrong with us, right? We start to challenge those beliefs in therapy, and we start to challenge some of the behaviors like, say, substance abuse, or using something to numb how we feel or the way that we think about ourselves, and have that opportunity to, in therapy, come out in therapy. I've had so many folks come out to me as the first person that they've ever told about their identity,
Mhm.
right? It helps, the process of coming out for yourself. Sometimes folks are coming out to themselves for the first time in therapy, and those moments can be really powerful. And we have therapy as a little bit of a sandbox to practice even just saying the words of I am followed by their identity, right?
Mhm.
But sometimes those words can be difficult to get out, and figuring out a plan and a path of being able to come out in their life, if it's safe, in a way that, they start to go from a place of fearing themselves and their identity and having that shame into celebrating that life, whether that's with their family of origin or if that's needs to be with made family. Those are some really big things that, queer therapy can be really helpful and useful on.
Mhm. And might you have any tips for somebody who's looking for a therapist for the first time, or they're not really sure how to find somebody that's going to be in line with, what they're looking for, helping them feel safe? So another example is somebody who's had a therapist who maybe didn't have a great experience and felt like even the therapist didn't really see them, or even went as far as to do something or say something to make the client feel like they've been rejected by the therapist. So I guess the question is like, what would you give as advice to somebody that's asking you like, but how do I find this therapist that's going to help me do what you're describing is to live authentically? This is like so much of what we do in therapy inside and outside of this community is helping our clients integrate how they feel internally and how they are expressing themselves and moving through the world outwardly, is to find authenticity. So for somebody that's looking for a therapist for the first time, maybe they're exploring identity or something about who they are has been a challenge for them in their life. Where do they start? How do you find the right person?
There's a handful of things that can be really helpful when trying to find a queer affirming therapist and someone that you're comfortable with, right? Well, if you're looking through the BetterHelp platform or whatever platform you're using, right, taking a look at what that person's biography says about themselves, what their bio says. If they will usually list that as one of the things that they typically work with, or they will say that they are queer affirming, or that they worked with gender and sexuality issues. It's usually a really good signal that they are, endorsing the fact that it's something that they are affirming of and that they have experience working with. Another thing is to sometimes, having to speak with a couple therapists to feel things out a little bit, right? Therapists, we're going to ask you a ton of questions, a ton of like deep, impactful, personal questions as we get to know you over time, right? And sometimes just like taking that moment to feel it out, let your gut guide a little bit of the experience for yourself and say, like, is this someone that I can go deep with? Is this someone that makes me feel safe, comfortable? And for everyone, that's going to be a little bit different, right? Sometimes there's factors that are really important also around someone's gender, around someone's gender identity. Sometimes it's really helpful to have someone that shares the identity with you. And for some folks, it's important that they don't, right? Sometimes we need a different perspective. And asking yourself some of those questions as you're going into your search can be really helpful, right? Am I more comfortable with one gender expression or the other based on traumatic experiences that you might have had, right? Say in the queer male identified community, there can sometimes be a lot of issues and trauma around, working with men, right? And it can sometimes be easier to broach therapy and walk in with someone female identified or trans, as opposed to someone that might signify something from someone's past, right? And asking ourselves, like, what things can be triggering? What is a space that can be really healthy and safe for me? And, sometimes dipping your toes in the pond with a couple folks. Sometimes it
Mhm.
takes a couple times to find that right fit, but when you find that right fit, it can change your life.
Mhm. I'm hearing overall an encouragement to folks to try things out, and a reminder that nobody can tell you who the right therapist is for you except for you. You're going to go based on what feels right for you, and it doesn't sound like from what you're saying that anyone can even tell anybody else these are the things that you must look for, and then that's the right person. It's here are some of the things that you should probably look for, and then you still probably need to talk to them a little bit to figure out whether it's the right fit, whether it feels right, which is also so important. um Folks, my own tip is like, you might have some assumptions or feelings about what's supposed to be the characteristic of who your therapist is going to be, but sometimes even that stuff, writing it out on paper, it ends up feeling different. So feel it out, try it out. um I think something that has really shifted in the past few years is the idea of going to therapy at all. And so my hope is that everybody out there has the opportunity and option to change therapists if they're feeling like the person that they've started out with is not the right fit for them.
Mm.
um, so I want to shift gears a little bit. We've talked quite a bit about some of the things that may exist that, contribute to folks in the community having mental health challenges, some thoughts around what they can do in terms of looking for a therapist or getting into therapy. Um, any tips for folks who may not have access? Maybe right now they don't have access to finding a therapist right now. Maybe it's something that they can do in the future. What are some other things that folks can be doing that might be struggling, and they're on their own, at least for all intents and purposes? I just want to make sure we get some good nuggets from you for folks that may not always have access to a therapist, which is the reality.
Mm. Yeah, I think that barriers to access to care are so numerous. It can be everything from financial to being, location based. I think that that's one thing that a platform like BetterHelp can be really helpful with is, you can find a therapist even if, location is an issue, right? If you're living in a rural area, you may not have a selection of therapists, right? So, you know, challenging or exploring whether an online option, right, could be really right for folks, because it is something that is, I think, newly becoming the norm and really beneficial for folks. But if we don't have any sort of access at all, you know, if you do have social supports, figure out who those folks are, lean on the folks. We don't need a horde of 20 people to go to. We just need that one person that
Mhm.
we can go to, we can be vulnerable with. And sometimes just having a person to be able to talk things out with can help lead us to a little bit of a plan, can help lead us to feeling heard and seen in a given moment, right? If, if we don't have a, family of origin that we can lean on, right? Figuring out who those made family members are, asking ourselves, are there some things foundationally that we do have access to and have the ability to engage in, right? Like looking at our basic self-care. How is our sleep? How are we feeding ourselves? How are we staying active in the way that we're able to, right? All of these things can help contribute to healthy brain chemistry, which can help with our mood regulation, which can help with how we're feeling and functioning overall in life. And it can be difficult to get to those things, if we are at a really low stage, right? And I encourage folks, if they're having, any sort of, really, really challenging mental health issues or thoughts of self-harm or any of those things, to be able to seek, the National Suicide Helpline, reach out to the Trevor Project, go to an emergency room to reach emergency care if we really need to, right? But trying to lean on the social supports that we have and really take care of ourselves on a basic level, right? And asking ourselves in those moments, one of my favorite things to say is just HALT. It's an acronym. So am I hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, right? And just really focus and think about, what is this emotion telling me that I need right now? Not what is this emotion, what's wrong with me for having this emotion, but what is this emotion and what can I do right now to ease that? It's not a bad thing to feel sad. It's not a bad thing to feel angry, right? It's telling us that something's off and that we need to address a need. Maybe we treat ourselves like we would treat a friend or like we would treat a child version of ourselves, right? And try to address that need in the moment and keep things simple until we're in a position or in a place that we can get to those resources, right? Depending on where you live, sometimes there are county and state level resources that you can access. And I really encourage folks to look at some of those imperfect but systemic supports that can sometimes be there and be really helpful.
Thank you. So I'm hearing self-care. I'm really glad that you talked about that piece. That's something that all of us can challenge ourselves to start doing, even without a therapist. So looking into ways that we can nourish ourselves. You shared a great acronym already for HALT. Tuning into what's going on with yourself in any given moment, and even trying to assess, like, what is it that I need in this moment? Is it something that I have control over? This kind of thing, for folks listening into this call that haven't been in therapy before, is one of many examples of things that you can review, learn, practice with your therapist, to start tuning into your present moment and figuring out how you can start fulfilling your own needs. A lot of times, I think a lot of us feel lost or unsure about how to move forward because we think that we can't actually do anything for ourselves. But you gave a really good example just now of how we can actually do quite a lot for ourselves in any given moment. It's just a matter of being able to regulate, getting to the headspace that we can take control again, which can be challenging and something that we can learn in therapy. Um, and like, if do you know of any other resources that folks can also turn to, say they do have access to the internet, which I'm assuming if they're watching this, any tips on other resources? I heard you mention things like NAMI and the Trevor Project. Are there other things that you think that folks should really have in their back pocket?
Yeah, I think that, well, there's a ton out there, right? And it's hard to kind of sort and wade through some of those. There are really wonderful things and apps that can be helpful. One thing I always encourage folks to do and to give a little try is guided meditations, right? Guided meditations can be a really great way to start practicing mindfulness skills, to be able to bring ourselves back into the present moment, right? If we have a foot in the past, oftentimes we can be depressed, live in guilt, shame, remorse. If we have a foot in the future, we're thinking about what could be or the problems that are going to come, right? Mindfulness and meditation can help plant our feet in the present moment, right? And anything from looking up YouTube videos to apps like that can be really wonderful, like Insight Timer, where there's a lot of free resources and a lot of free meditations to be able to dive into, right? And a lot of styles of meditation, right? Because not everything works for everyone, right? Being able to tap into some of those things that don't cost anything, right? Can be really lovely, and BetterHelp also, I think, does a really great job, on Instagram and TikTok of being able to give little snippets of, intentions for the day, of skills in and around certain things that the therapists provide, which can be really neat to look at. That's a really cool resource. And then, as far as free resources, like looking around your community and seeing, like, what are the things that are provided there? Are there like clubs? Are there like public pools? Are there green spaces and parks to be able to engage with, right? When we look at, quite a lot of studies, there's a huge correlation between green space and getting out in nature, getting out in parks, things that we don't have to have a lot of resources to engage in, right? Can do a lot for our wellness and do a lot for just how we're feeling in the moment, right? Which is all we really have control over.
Yeah. And as you were speaking about mindfulness and getting into practice, like grounding exercises, stuff that can bring us back to this present moment. I'm also thinking of, like, I also focus a lot on mindfulness based skills with my clients. And part of the reason that many of us do this is because so many of our clients can tend to turn to something else when they're unable to sit with their own feelings in a present moment, because then they start doing things to try to numb those feelings, not think about them at all. You just talked about, people being stuck in the past or panicking about the future and really not being able to thrive in the in between, which is life, which is present moment. And I want to tie this back to something you talked about earlier as being quite a prevalent challenge in the community, which is substance use. And folks will understandably turn to substances, not only to have a good time, but also to not think about the bad times, to not feel, the repercussions of having trauma in the past, or being worried about, what does my future look like when the world doesn't accept me? Am I able to get the jobs that I want? Am I able to make the impression that I want on people if they know something about me? So I can see substance use becoming this thing, right? But I'm wondering if you can also share now, for folks out there who might be feeling isolated in their experience with substance, what's a journey that you've kind of observed in the community? Like, why is it that we see substance use as being such a prevalent challenge?
Mm. Yeah, I think that, well, it's exactly that, right? Trying to numb some of those feelings, right? And I love a, line from Brene Brown, who I very much adore. It's like we can selectively numb, right?
Mm.
So if we're numbing those negative emotions, we're numbing joy, we're numbing connection, all of those sorts of things, right? Certain substances can manufacture that for a very short term. But what happens with substance use is something that might work in the beginning, right, becomes something that eventually it doesn't address the anxiety and depression and actually makes it worse. But then we end up in a cycle where we can't stop. It's like folks describe it like not being able to live with or without that substance. What ends up happening is we don't have any other coping skill over time, right? Any emotion, any feeling, we go to a drink or a drug or a substance to be able to solve that, right? What therapy can help us do is be able to recognize and look at what that pattern has looked like over time and be able to figure out what sorts of skills and what sorts of safeguards we need to put in place to start addressing that, right? And it is extremely common as a problem, well, at large in this country, at large in the
Mhm.
world, but especially in the queer community. But there are tons of supports. One of the most successful things are 12-step groups. They're all over the place for a reason. I encourage you to look up, AA meetings, NA meetings in your local area, because there are huge groups of folks having the exact same experience as you who have found a solution that is not using that substance, finding a way to be present, finding a way of dealing with some of those traumas, some of those feelings that have led you to wanting to numb. You're not alone. There's
Mhm.
there are huge recovery communities all over the place, big towns, small towns, and that's a place that I think folks can also go to not be alone. There's a component that I think, there's a lot of the healing that needs to happen in a group setting, and there's a lot of the healing that needs to happen in an individual setting, right? To get to the underlying causes and conditions, but then also have a community of folks to start learning how to live a sober life, right?
Mhm.
We can live in certain places where it can seem like on the outside, right? Everyone is living this lifestyle and partying and doing all these things. But when we fall into a place where it's a substance use issue, substance use disorder, right? If we're going to be clinical about it, right? It can feel very isolating. But there are huge communities of people that live sober lives and all of those things. I myself being one of those people in very long-term sobriety. And there's a huge life outside of trying to numb and shift away
Mhm.
from some of those feelings. Your therapist might have that experience too. You might have friends or people in your world that you don't even know or realize have struggled with the same thing in the past, right?
Yeah.
Uh, so I think there's a lot of resources. That's another cost-free resource, right? It doesn't cost anything to go to a 12-step meeting. And if it is, really severe, there are intensive outpatient programs and things that might be appropriate for folks too.
Mhm.
But I think that's something too to ask a therapist about because they can help assess the level of risk and what support you might need to
Mhm.
be able to be successful in either changing your relationship with those substances or having a severed relationship with those substances.
Yeah. Again, such a loaded subtopic in the topic of mental health considerations for the queer community. Like, like I think so many people, like you said, start using and enjoying substance because sometimes some of these things can replicate a good feeling. And you mentioned that it's temporary a lot of the time, but often people are chasing that temporary good feeling for however long. And it's complicated because a lot of the alcohol and drug use is so pervasive in the going out scene, right? Like going out to find your chosen family. A lot of
Mm,
times it's associated with party drugs and having a good time. So it can get messy sometimes, I think, right? Where it's like this thing that's associated, related to, connected to the good feelings, the people I love spending time with, the people I feel accepted by. And for some people, it can
mm,
turn into something else very quickly over
mm,
a long period of time. And it's complicated to get out of it because it's so heavily associated with good people, good
mm,
feelings. But, for folks that if you start noticing that these things are really getting in the way of, like you said, feeling other good things like joy and
Mm,
creating meaningful and lasting relationships, it's getting into trouble, right? You're not remembering everything that you've done in a day or in a week. Like these kinds of things are indicators that it could be a good thing for you to consider exploring. Are there other ways that I can feel good? Are there other ways that I can meaningfully connect with people? And for you to mention, that there's folks within the community that are living sober lives, I think it speaks to this journey that so many folks do have of, finding themselves through this stuff and then finding themselves and figuring out identity without this stuff. Um, and I do hope that folks that might be struggling with this do see that it's complicated, and nobody is suggesting that like you just got to stop cold turkey today, because it's not that easy for a lot of people. But there is support out there. Another interesting thing that we're talking about is, 12 step is very much known to be talking about a higher power. And if folks are concerned if that's related to religion, because I know there's religious trauma that we talked about. Again, these are such big topics that are very difficult to cover every aspect of in such a short time. But there are 12-step groups out there that are queer affirming, and you're going to find a community and a space that's going to be safe, like you mentioned. And
mm,
I really do hope that folks consider that 12 step is an option. It's not the only, and there are many other things out there.
mm.
So it sounds like from some of your advice and tips here is all this stuff is also worth exploring further with a therapist who might be able to help you figure out what it is that you need in order to live a happy and healthy, fulfilling life.
Mm.
Um, and we've covered so much, you've shared so much good information here. Is there anything else that you feel is important to include in this conversation today?
Yeah, I think, one thing that can be really, really central to all of this, and I've mentioned a few times, is this concept of internalized homophobia, internalized transphobia, internalized queerphobia, however we look at it, right? And this is the most common core belief that I see across the community, right? Is having this core belief that there is something wrong, something broken, you know, something defective about our core identity. And I encourage anyone, whether it's through therapy, with friends, to bring this up in conversation, to talk about it if it's there, if it's sitting under the surface. Folks that have the biggest queer communities and experience in the community can still have that somewhere deep down in their core of themselves, that thread follows through, right? So make it a part of conversations, bring it up. There's a reason why pride parades and festivals exist, right? Because it's us practicing the opposite of that. It's us practicing celebrating ourselves. And there's a reason why the community engages with it, right? And I would encourage anyone to really ask ourselves those questions of, are there ways that we're thinking, feeling, acting that might be feeding that beast of internalized homophobia for anyone, right? Which I've really seen, spread out into so many other areas of life, whether it's substance abuse, anxiety and depression, family issues, relationships, issues with work, right? So I would encourage anyone to really ask themselves some of those critical questions.
Thank you so much. And that's a tough one, to have anybody really kind of self-evaluate their own beliefs. Sometimes we're not even aware of it. And when something is internalized like homophobia, some people are not even willing to acknowledge that that might exist. I think some people do experience having this such a complicated thing, and they don't realize that that's actually how they feel. And sometimes we can hear it from people that we really care about, like, oh, I heard something that makes me think that you don't fully accept who you are. If you notice that in yourself, even if you notice it in someone that you care deeply about, like you're saying, bring it up if it's something on you. I think it's even worth it to touch on it if it's someone that you love deeply and you notice something there. Of course, you shouldn't be pressed to feel like you got to call your friends out on this kind of stuff. But if you notice your friends going through a struggle and it's something that you yourself have had success in processing, exploring, getting through, you're a really important person too. And so, you know, the folks listening now, I know that these are people that may have challenges, but they could also be the people that help their friends through challenges. And I think that that's a lovely thing of being part of any community. So Nicholas, thank you so much for your time, for your energy, for so much of this wonderful information for us. Where is somewhere that folks can learn more about you?
I have an Instagram where I share things that can be really helpful, and it's at nickflick_psych. Also, I have a website, Nicholas Flickinger, LCSW.com. Those are places where if anyone wants to see a little bit about my background or resources that I put out there, those are some places to be able to see some of that.
Great. Thank you so much. We'll link that below. So thanks again, everybody, and hope you all have a great day.
Thank you so much.